Most of you guys probably know who I am. For those that don't know who I am, I'm Jacob, but you just call me Koshak.
Can we get qualifications?
What are my qualifications? That's a great question. What are my qualifications to teach this lecture? Well, I have spent about more than that, about 6 to 7 years of my life reading a lot of metaphysical or metaphysicians. Particularly, I'm very interested in Heidegger and Husserl, as well as a little bit of Sartre. So I think that I'm a little bit qualified, probably more so than many of the LB lab leaders who teach this lecture. So, yeah. You done with your question? Done being sassy? Cool. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit. This is going to be very, very basic introduction course because honestly, if I were to talk about the entire history of metaphysics, it would take definitely a lot more than just 1 hour. I mean, I could talk about Heidegger for probably at least 2 to 3 hours in order to get through just Being in Time, which is one of his most popular books. But I'm going to try to hurricane through it, and then once we do that, I'll talk about how it's applicable to debate, and then you guys can get questions or comments or concerns about anything you heard. You guys can let me know. All right? Cool. Yeah. Okay. So, wow. What is metaphysics? Does anybody want to take a stab at what Mr. Wolf is saying about metaphysics? There's a lot of big words. There's a lot, not big words, but words that can mean a lot of different things that are there. So we've already lost one. So, too confused. Anybody? Yes? Well, that's true, but in relation to, hello, come on in relation to what? Yeah, what's being? Well, I mean, yeah, but what does that mean? I guess being is a venue in which we discuss ontology, right? Which, by the way, what's ontology?
Study being.
Oh my gosh. Yes. So the study of what it means to be, right? Metaphysics is a study of the human essence, right? And how the human essence comes to be in conjunction or in relation to objects and subjects, right? What's a subject? Huh? No, well, I mean, yeah, it's something. What's a subject, though? So if I say there's an object and I say there's a subject, what do we usually assume subjects to be?
Something we control?
No. Well, Nietzsche would say yeah, but we'll get to that. Subjects are humans. Traditionally, in a lot of metaphysical lectures or in a lot of metaphysical books, subjects are humans. Objects are those things that surround humans, right? So, being is a question of the subject and how that subject interacts and investigates their relation to objects in particular categories, such as nature. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions on that concept? Okay, cool. Awesome. It only took 5 minutes. So, let's talk a little bit about the origin of metaphysics, right? So, we're going to have to go back pretty far, because metaphysics actually is an ongoing project that has evolved and adapted throughout the years and has taken many names. But originally, the origin is credited with, I guess it's not like Thales or Thales or Melitus, I don't know. But he taught that all things come from something singular, which he called the arc. He was the first recorded metaphysician credited by Aristotle. This is going to be important because a lot, you'll see, and I'll hope to make this clear when we discuss more about metaphysics, that there will be branching beliefs that we come from many sources or that we come from one source, right? So the arc is what Thales, call him Thales, whatever. Doesn't matter. It matters, but yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Parmenides. We talked a little bit about what is an unchanging being. So it's either Parmenides or Parmenides, I don't know. Parmenides believed that we had a static being. What does static mean? Yeah, something that doesn't change, right? We are given one essence, and that essence is unchanging. Right? Who we are as people has been predetermined and And that essential quality of the human, of the subject, does not change. It really doesn't begin to change until Aristotle, who credits both Parmenides and Thales with the investigation of metaphysics, writes his book, or it's not really a book, but it was published. It was his teachings on metaphysics, in which he talks about the essence of objects. And in particular, the only thing you have to worry about in the context of Aristotle is that Aristotle was one of the first philosophers or first metaphysicians to believe that we reflect on other things, and that reflection on other things changes who we are as people. So he was one of the first believers in a fluid kind of identity. Does that make sense? Have I said anything that you guys have any questions about? Awesome. So there's the history of it. Let's talk about this foolish guy, Kant. So, Kant believes that reality is broken into two different segments. Okay? We have the nominal and we have the phenomenal, where we actually get the study, or where Husserl really gets a lot of the study of phenomenology, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So, does anybody want to guess what phenomenal is? I mean, I know it's up there, but what does that mean? What does it mean, the external and the real world? Like the actual world, quote unquote. Yes. You're kind of close. So it does have to do, it could do with the physicalness of the world, but Kant believes that it's a little bit deeper than that, right? Kant thinks that the nominal is that which we can't experience or see. It's the truth of the world, which is the unknown. And so Kant believes that there are two, as their reality is broken into two realms. One that can be sensed, which phenomenology is actually a branch of philosophy that believes that our senses create our identity. So Kant believes in the phenomenal, which is the world we can see through our senses and experience, and then the nominal, which is the actual truth of the world, but we can't experience it. In order to understand the true world, we need to experience, and we need to have what's called a diaphanous view of consciousness. Diaphanous. Which means, for those of us, and even I don't really know what the actual literal translation of that means, but it just means we have to have what's called a God's eye view. Kant points it as. We have to see the world from God's eyes. Which means we have to see the world for what it really is. But we're humans, we can't do that. So it doesn't work. Is that all I have for him? Yeah. Does anybody have any questions about Kant? The only thing you guys have to worry about is that Kant was one of the first ones that just deconstructed the world and created two categories. One is the phenomenal, and it's important to understand the phenomenal because that's where Husserl gets a lot of his philosophy and phenomenology, which we'll talk about, because Husserl is very important in that. Yes?
What's the difference? I don't understand the difference between like the real world and
Yeah.
the world we can sense.
Sure, so the world we can sense is those things like, I know this is real, right? I can touch it, I can feel it with my senses, right? Now there might be some kind of essential truth to this table, right, or this, table. There might be some kind of deeper meaning that I'm not grasping, right? Like perhaps a purpose for which this table was created that I might not fully understand.
So the sense is like the surface level and the real is like beneath that? Okay.
Yeah. Like the real is the purpose behind it and the truth, right? The real actual reality of the earth is what Kant describes as the nominal. And we don't know what it is. It's kind of weird. Yeah.
So would nominal be like freedom and phenomenal be like a statue?
Yeah, so like, absolutely. So like the Statue of Liberty, for instance, like we can see that, right? But we can't like see the freedom that it perhaps could represent, right? Or if it's even meant to represent freedom at all. Like these are things we have no 100% knowledge of. And we can never know that. That's what Kant would say. Yes?
So like, because vision is something like a sensory perception, because like nothing we see is real. Something that would be like because like that's what we're sensing, but it's not necessarily what is actually the world.
Yeah, so like, yeah, actually Kant goes in to say that the possibility could be that everything we sense is not real. But we can't know it. I think it's really silly, but we can't know it.
You're not real, Koshak.
No, I might not be, right? That's the argument Kant would make. Like, you can see me, if you wanted to, you could get up here and like touch me, but that does not mean that I'm actually real. It just means your perception of me is real. Yes?
Does Kant use a post-structuralist critique or just structuralist?
I think it's a structuralist kind of critique, more than post, yeah. We don't get,
Does he ever dive into like post-structuralism?
not that I'm aware of, but I only know Kant as it regards to the categorical imperative and metaphysical stuff. And I don't like Kant, because I don't believe that we can't sense I don't think the nominal is real. I think we can sense everything, and that's what a lot of other metaphysicians believe too. So, let's talk about this silly guy. Let's talk about Nietzsche. So, have you guys ever heard the joke, like, Nietzsche's a fascist?
Yes.
It's not a joke. Nietzsche is absolutely a fascist. And you will see why in a minute, okay? Nietzsche believed, similar to Kant, that we can't experience the true world without the God's eye view, the diaphanous. However, in order to compensate for that, Nietzsche believes two things that are different from Kant. He believes in what is called perspectivism, right? That all of our knowledge is based on our perspective, which is kind of similar to what Kant believes in the phenomena as opposed to the nomenon. But Nietzsche believes our identity is predicated on the will to power. How many of you guys have heard the will to power, right? So for those of you that don't know what the will to power is, Nietzsche, in a too long kind of don't want to read thing, is that everything's about power, and our whole purpose in surviving is to exert power and control over everything. Whether it be people, whether it be objects in nature. That fuels our identity, according to Nietzsche. And that is pretty fascist. The desire to control things, which he says is a good thing, is probably, pretty fascist.
Why does he claim it as a good thing?
Because it's all we know, is what Nietzsche would say, I think. Like the will to power is, because Nietzsche is so I guess in order to understand that I need to explain perspectivism a bit more. Perspectivism is not only a notion that everything is based on our perspective, but that's the only thing that's true. Does that make sense? There is no universal truth except the truth that we perceive it to be. Yeah?
Then what about omni-perspectives and stuff like that?
What do you mean?
Is that a different way to interpret perspectivism?
What do you mean by omni-perspective?
Like the argument that we don't know what eggs taste like from cockroach. It's usually used to justify polls. It's about why
we don't know what X tastes like.
No, we have to. It's like we have to take everyone's perspective.
No, Nietzsche would say that's bad.
Okay.
Yeah, perspectivism is all about the individual's perspective, and that is all that matters in the context of identity and how we frame who we are as people, and also epistemology, like how we create knowledge. And then, because that's true, or that there is no moral truth, right? No universal, right? It's all based on how we perceive morality to be. That's why we all are embedded with this will to power in order to survive. So we exert that power and control over others. And that's, that's a good thing, according to Nietzsche. I don't think it's a good thing. Yes?
Not like power that's exerted over us.
Yeah, so like Nietzsche would say that we should fight that. We should try to counteract that power with our own power. It's like a constant battle of power.
So he's like, power struggle is all that exists.
Yeah, life is a constant struggle for survival and exerting power and control over others, and creating what's called the master and the slave of morality, where the master reigns and controls over the slave and institutes what he perceives to be morality, and the slave accepts it because the slave cannot or does not exert power and control to become the master. He uses that also as a justification why like Christianity is bad, because like he perceives Christianity to be a master over the slaves, which willingly accept this notion of God that has been created by humanity.
What's Nietzsche's notion of God?
What's that?
What is Nietzsche's notion of God?
Yeah, but so when he says God is dead, right?
Yeah, right.
He is perceiving it to mean that the notion of God has been utilized as a form of power in order to create a master morality over the slaves. That does not mean like slavery on black people. We know that, right? It's just like slavery over all people. Since we've heard so many lectures from people about like anti-violence and stuff. Yeah.
The lecture like an hour ago was insane.
Yeah.
And I thought it was pretty cool, but it
Yeah.
went over my head.
Yeah. So master slave morality. Very, very fascist. Very bad. But Nietzsche's a really cool guy. Kind of. Alright, let's talk about Husserl. So, I'm going to only spend a little bit of time on Husserl because honestly, a lot of what Husserl talks about gets replicated and regurgitated by Heidegger. And I think Heidegger does it a lot better than Husserl does. Husserl is considered to be the modern father of the phenomenology, or the phenomenological movement, which is a philosophy of how we approach our consciousness and the objects of the world. I'll explain that when we get to Heidegger, which will be next, because that's really where I know a lot more about it, in the context of how Husserl frames it. But knowledge of these essences is only possible by bracketing, which for those of you who have been in my lab or have talked with me about Heidegger, Heidegger talks about it in the context of framing, right? So Husserl, who is actually, this is not a funny story, this is a very tragic story. Husserl, who was a Jewish philosopher in Germany, was the teacher of Heidegger, and then Heidegger actually got him kicked out of the university for being a Jew during the Third Reich, because Heidegger was a part of the Nazi party. Yes? Oh. Yeah. Pretty tragic. But Husserl influenced a lot of Heidegger's philosophy. So when we talk about Heidegger, which I know a lot about, I can begin to kind of explain it to you a little bit better in the context of that. Does anybody have any questions about Husserl? So everybody that I've kind of showed you, Kant gets used in debate a little bit. Probably I don't think anybody uses Kantian metaphysics in debate, not at least that I've heard of. I guess you could. Nietzsche you can use in debate if you want to like be a fascist, I guess. And then Husserl, nobody really uses Husserl in debate. So,
Nietzsche used for like scap.
I've
heard because I've heard Nietzsche used for scap.
It can, I guess, because he was a big opponent of universal morals.
Okay.
So that's I guess another place where Kant and Nietzsche would differ, because Kant believes in like universality of truths and morals, whereas Nietzsche would say that that's bad. That's the slave morality. We have to like deviate away from that and be the masters. Which is going to be I'll make a lot of references to Nietzsche because Heidegger's philosophy is so radically different than Nietzsche's in the context of what is power and what is control. So, well, let's talk about this guy. My man Heidegger. Okay. So, the first book Heidegger writes, Being in Time. He writes it in the 30s when he's very young. I think he was like in his late teens when he writes this book, or starts to begin to write it, I believe. And then he finishes it, I think he finishes it actually as he's in university. I could be wrong about that though. So he takes Husserl's phenomenology and pushes it for an ontological reflection, right? He focuses more upon how we craft our identity based upon how we interact with objects and with nature and other subjects. Almost like Husserl, but he gets into a little bit more detail. So, in Being in Time, he creates what's called the Dasein, which is a German word utilized to explain that which dwells there. That human, or that subject, which is dwelling or being there. That sounds a little bit weird right now, but as I explain it further, it'll start to make a bit more sense. And actually, I'm glad we got through all that other stuff really quick, because I can spend a lot of time talking about Heidegger. Okay, so Dasein is like, think of Dasein like us, right? We're all people. A Dasein is somebody that reflects and dwells upon their position in the world, okay? Heidegger believes that we as people do not know who we are until we connect with nature and with other people. That connection, that authentic connection, he calls it, is critical because it fuels the way that we interact with ourselves and with the other. Heidegger thinks that the earth is constantly concealing itself from us, which is bad. Not that the earth is a bad thing, but that the concealment of the earth is something that is inauthentic. It creates an inauthentic human. So there is a process that humanity goes through where there is a concealing and what's called an unconcealing. Okay? So, the reason why the unconcealing of the earth is important in the context of Heidegger is that the unconcealing allows us to see the world for what it truly is. Okay? Does that make sense so far? So we have people, and the only way people can be authentic is when they see the world as it truly is. Heidegger calls that the unconcealing.
What's the process of doing this?
Sure, cool. So, Heidegger says that we have to reflect inwardly and meditate upon, and reflect upon a lot of the, what's it called? A lot of the situations we find ourselves in, particularly when we exit what Heidegger calls a state of fallenness. Okay? So to best explain fallenness, I'm going to use a diagram or like pictures because it'll make it a lot easier. So, fallenness, okay. So pretend this is you, okay? Right? Heidegger says that when we reflect and see the world, the earth, whatever, as it truly is, then we become authentic. We can become authentic individuals, which have an authentic identity that is truly fluid. Okay? Now, what happens though is that, and we've all experienced this in some way or another, we experience what's called, what Heidegger coins as a falling, or a fallenness, where what happens is that we will fall into a state in which the world will conceal itself from us. This is a really bad marker. Okay. We fall into a state in which the earth will conceal itself from us. Does anybody want to take a guess, like, what could distract us from seeing and experiencing the earth?
Other people.
Yes, other people can. What else?
Peace.
What? Peace?
Yeah. Like,
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. No, not. So he's referring to peace, and he's referring to stability. And I'll explain that and what that means in the context of what Heidegger coins as the angst. Anything else that could distract us? Yes.
like false idols, like money.
Yeah. Right? False idols, false experiences. So, easiest way is to think of it like this. What happens when we're in school and we're with other people? What happens usually when you're in a high school and you have a bunch of people? What's inevitably going to happen? Social interaction, but what happens at the basis of that social interaction? What's created?
Distraction.
What?
Distraction.
Okay, wait, what?
A distraction.
Well, yeah, but what?
Because you're focused on something.
Okay, no. So think of it.
You're
So
focused on one person.
okay, what?
Speech.
Well, yeah. Okay. If I identify myself as a nerd, which group would I follow? Why?
You got most social.
The coquette.
Sure. You identify with a group and a clique. The correct word was clique or group, right? Social groups form. Heidegger says that this is a natural thing that humanity will tend to do. It is a tendency for us to seek to seek stability, right? So, whenever we're with other people, we get lost in the crowd, right? We embrace one identity, and the reason why we embrace it so easily is because it's static, right? So, what happens is once we lose ourselves in the crowd, once we lose ourselves in, like our phones is a good one. There's actually a very good video representing that in which people walk on the earth. And actually, if we have time, I'll show it to you because it's a great visual representation of that. But what happens is that we lose ourselves to different objects in the world. or to different subjects. And we lose our identity as a result of it. Yes?
Wait, so basically, well, our social interaction takes away our intellectual identity, is what Heidegger is saying.
Heidegger says that it can,
Oh.
right?
So there's a possibility of it.
Yes, we have a tendency, and why do we do that? Why do we follow cliques in social groups?
To conform.
Why do we do that though? What does that give us?
It gives us another sense of identity. We get to identify ourselves.
Well, it gives us an identity. Well, it ends up inevitably giving us an identity. But why do we follow like social groups? Why do we do it?
It gives us stability.
Yeah, it gives us stability, right? We can refer back to something. It's that referential point that Heidegger criticizes so deeply, actually. And the problem, though, for Heidegger is that we have a tendency to yearn for stability in life. We don't want life to be chaotic and unknowable. We fear the unknown. That is the heart and soul of the critique Heidegger makes. We fear the unknown. Yes?
So it's kind of like Nietzsche's theory of like the herd mentality
Yes.
and like the theory of resentment, like our
Yes.
organization towards suffering makes us hate everything around us.
Yes, but for Heidegger, he actually takes a lot from Nietzsche in that he doesn't believe resentment. He doesn't think that happens, though. Like, what he perceives, though, is a little bit different. So we enter social cliques and groups. We disidentify with ourselves. Well, not disidentify. We enter the state of fallenness, right? And we do it because we want stability, right? We act for the sole purpose of controlling things, okay? That's important. Because, and I don't know if I have it in this slide. I might have it in the next slide. That's important, because Heidegger believes the way we perceive the world and the way what he calls the way we frame the world carries over into every other aspect of our life. So think of it like this. Why do we follow social groups and cliques? Because we want security and stability. If we allow ourselves to buy into the illusion that we can control the chaotic world around us, what happens when we take that same frame of mind and use that frame to observe other people?
We can control everything around us.
Yes. Yes. Heidegger believes that the way we perceive the earth, and not only earth, but the objects and the subjects in it, we create a frame. Think of it like a lens. And that lens is how we perceive the earth and all the other people in the earth. Right? Does that make sense? Do I need to go back over that? I see your brow's kind of furrowing there. What's wrong?
No, it's understood.
Yeah, so Heidegger thinks that the way we frame the world, if we frame the world coming from a point at which we seek to control the uncertainty of the world, that attempt and desire to control will carry over in the way that we perceive humans. That mode of thought, how many of you guys have heard a technocratic mode of thought? That is the technocratic mode of thought Heidegger criticizes. Technocratic thought, managerial thought, calculative thought are all words to describe when we have framed the world in a way that perceives us as being able, willing to control the earth, and that it's something that's good. And the reason that that's bad is because it severs the ability for the world to show itself as it truly is, to unconceal itself, and we control other people as well. Which is also bad because Heidegger believes that our connection not only with nature and the true earth, but the connection with other people and the other is what formulates our identity and ontology as authentic humans. Does that make sense? So, Heidegger has a word to characterize, what it means to feel fearful of the unknown. Does anybody want to take a stab who has not been in my lab, because I've explained this to you guys? Yes? What's up? No, so framing is how we perceive the world. But if we perceive the world in a certain way, and and that perception gets shaken what usually happens?
Chaos comes into play. We begin to suffer.
But why? Why do we perceive ourselves as suffering?
We perceive ourselves as suffer because that is what we give. That I believe that like we give something a meaning at that point. We make it believe like
Right.
if something is not stable, that is suffering. And
Sure. Yeah, and our desire to create stability is the root of the problem, Heidegger would say. So, but let me get it as an example, because I think this was a pretty good example I gave my lab. So let's say I want you guys to imagine you are all on a lake. Imagine you're in the middle of a very, very large lake, straight in the center, and it's a very, very murky lake. You're just floating. You can't see what's below you. You don't know what's below you. What would you feel? This is the part where we interact. Somebody else. You've been on point. I appreciate it, but no, you're part of my lab. Come on, what would you feel? I know what I would feel.
Scared.
Sure, so you feel scared. Why are you scared though?
I feel excited.
Okay.
Like uncertain.
Yes, you'd feel scared you'd feel uncertain. You would feel not fear, because Heidegger says that fear is fear of the known. Like we know what it is that we are afraid of if we are fearful, right? But it's another word, it begins with an A.
I meant anxiety.
There you go. Yeah, oh my gosh. You're part of, you're gonna do drills.
Oh.
Yeah, we feel anxiety, anxiousness. The difference between fear and anxiety is that we know what it is we're fearful of when we fear it. If a guy comes in here and pulls out a gun, and I'm afraid, I'm fearful, because I know what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of the person that has the gun that can end my life. If I am anxious, I don't know what it is I'm anxious of. And it's that uncertainty that unconceals the world, because it shows the world as it truly is. And then, once the world has unconcealed itself to us, then we can begin to meditate and create a frame based on what is the real. Does that make sense? I see you.
No, I hear you.
Okay. Yes.
I don't quite understand like how like meditating allows us for the revealing of the unconcealing of the world.
Right. So like we meditate on when the world unconceals itself to us, right? So like Heidegger says, and there's a lot of ways that this happens. And so Heidegger says that the angst, or the angst, he calls it the angst.
Okay.
What?
Fancy.
The angst is German. He makes up words. It's fine. He says that the angst is that anxiousness, right? But the angst is the process in which it disrupts our notion of what is the controllable world. And it's in that disruption of that point that we need to meditate. Does that make sense? So it's not like we just meditate. Like I just sit down and, we pull out a guitar and sing Kumbaya. Like Heidegger probably would say, that's cool. Well, I don't know. He'd probably shout something in angry German. But the point, though, is that once we disrupt the notion of control, we see the world for as it truly is. And then that's when we have to reflect on that. Because once we reflect on that point in which the world has unconcealed itself to us, then we can create a frame of the world that is a pure frame. And then, once we have seen the world for as it truly is, we can internalize that framing and become authentic.
Okay, so what I'm getting from that is that first we disrupt the notion of control.
Yes.
And then that reveals the true, that unconceals the true nature of the world.
Yes.
And then we meditate upon how to frame the world for as it truly is.
Yes. That is it. That's being in time.
Okay.
600 pages. You've got it too long, you don't want to read that.
So we were disrupting control over others, or
No. No. The notion of control we hold.
Okay.
Well, that we hold as people, right? If we perceive we control things, it creates a framing of the world that is inauthentic. And in that inauthenticity, we can't authenticate as individuals. We can't become true humans. We can't become who we truly should be, right? We create a static conception of identity, which is bad. Because for Heidegger, identity is fluid. It always changes, and it's supposed to. That's the point. Which is is probably another reason why. So do you see how it's so starkly different from Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche's notion of power and control over nature is exactly what Heidegger would criticize. Because that, he says, would be the root cause of all the crises that we have as people. Birthed in this notion to try to control and manage the world and other people. Simply because we are too afraid of this notion of the uncertain and the unknown. Yes?
Yeah, we do meditate to ponder upon what the world could be, but is there any certainty that we would actually be able to determine how the world is?
See, I think Heidegger would say that, first of all, that question is rooted in a technocratic thought, because it's rooted in a notion of the unsurety of the unknown, right? Whereas Heidegger would just say you need to just let it be, to let go, and to just let go of that anxiety, and the world will reveal itself to you inevitably.
Alright, so like never think of an end point, just think of what.
For Heidegger, yeah, actually, Heidegger, there is no end. The end, and actually he talks about it, we won't talk about this because it's irrelevant. Well, I mean, it's very relevant in context of Heidegger's philosophy, but it would take a little bit too long to talk about how, because being and time, there's two things in there. There's being, and then there's the notion of time. And time for Heidegger is a combination of the uncertain future and the certain past, combining to make the present.
Okay.
And that doesn't stop until we die. So,
the world is ever revealed.
does the world ever reveal itself to us?
The world is like constantly revealing itself, so it never
Yeah.
stops revealing.
No, it's a constant process of unconcealing and concealing. And the concealing is usually because we have concealed ourselves or have forced the earth to conceal itself.
Got it.
Because of the way we approach reality and the way that we approach and utilize our desire to control things because of our fear, our innate fear of the unknown. Oh, isn't that exciting? My gosh. It's not so exciting when you actually read it, because like that book is just terrible to read. It's a phenomenally good book. It's god awful to read though. Took way too long. So let's talk about essays concerning technology. If you're going to read anything from Heidegger that's going to help you with debate, you probably should read essays concerning technology. I pretty much gave it away because of, but there are a couple terms I want to go over specific to Heidegger that you can use in debate. So technocratic is one. He actually coins that phrase and utilizes it quite a lot in essays concerning technology. He also creates what's called the standing reserve. How many of you guys have heard that term, standing reserve? Yeah, does anybody want to like take a guess what that might be after listening to that very long rant about Heidegger? Yes?
It's like something is just waiting for something else to be.
Yeah, so like a standing reserve is our perception of everything as an object that merely exists only for our own use. So it is a standing reserve, as in it is within our reserves and we can use it whenever we see fit. This essay is where a lot of Heideggerian critiques get cut from. Because it's cool to talk about and read about being and time. It doesn't really get used much in debate, though. Yeah, so Heidegger. That's pretty much it. You guys have any questions about that? Yes?
What role is, I tried to read Being in Time.
Yeah.
I was particularly interested in how, what role does death play in Heidegger's philosophy?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So like, death in Heidegger and Sartre's philosophy, and actually I forgot to explain this. I'm glad you brought that question up. Angst, Heidegger believes that the quickest way and the easiest way for us to experience true anxiousness and to shatter the world around us is to experience a near-death experience. Does anybody, I don't know if you guys have met somebody that has had a near-death experience, but what is usually something that sets, what do people usually say whenever they have met somebody that has a near-death experience?
The most common thing that they say is that their life flashes before their eyes.
Yeah, and then what happens? What? Kind of, I guess, but why though? What happens? Their perception of what? Has to do with their perception. What happens? They usually live differently. Why is that?
The experience may open them up to a different,
Yeah.
Like their perception of life changes.
Yeah, their perception of the world changes. right? Heidegger says that the reason that is because they have seen the world for as it truly is. Death plays an integral role in both Heidegger and Sartre's philosophy and in metaphysics. Because, why? What have we talked about this whole time? What's humans' biggest fear, greatest fear, or not greatest fear, but greatest source of anxiety? What?
The unknown.
Yeah, and what's the greatest unknown of them all?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually really exciting if you think about it. But that's only if you like read Heidegger for a long time and start to like really go crazy. Death is the greatest moment in the philosophy of Heidegger because when it is the reflection on death and the true experience of death that solidifies this notion that we have no control. And to Heidegger, that's the most beautiful thing we can come to realize, which is that we have no control over life. Then, once we enter at that starting point and frame our experience of the world based on that notion, then we can see the world for as it truly is, and then we can really become who we are meant to be as people. So death is very important, because death represents the greatest anxiety and unknown for humanity. Because honestly, we don't know what happens, right? We come up with theories to try to explain it, but at the end of the day, we don't know what happens once we take our last breath and they bury us, or burn us, or do whatever it is they're going to do. For Heidegger, that is a source of beauty, but also anxiety for humanity. Does that make sense? Cool. Talking about death, the debate camp. Yeah. Yeah, Dasein.
Yeah. So basically, does Heidegger say that our experiences are essence?
Yeah. So yes, he does. Our experiences and the way that we perceive the world and interact with the other and with objects in the world shapes the way that we become, right? And that will determine if we are authentic or inauthentic.
So how does that differ from Sartre's philosophy of existentialism?
It doesn't. Not that much. That's because Sartre takes a lot from Heidegger in his book Being and Nothingness. Sartre actually takes quite a lot from Being and Time. So actually it's very similar. There are a few differences which I'll go over when we talk about Sartre, which we're about to talk about right now.
So how can Heidegger try as much as he can to separate himself from French existentialism, even rejecting?
You know, that's an interesting question. I think, and honestly, I don't have a solid answer because there are many theories why Heidegger hated existentialists so much, even though a lot of his philosophy is existentialist. Some theories say that he just hated existential philosophers, and as such, he did not want to be grouped into that category. Others believe that it was probably because he wanted to create a radical new form of existentialism that would not be categorized under that. But yes, Heidegger had a great displeasure of existentialism, and there are many reasons that people say why. I haven't read those because I'm honestly really not interested in why Heidegger hated existentialism, but he did not.
Sartre rejected the notion of metaphysics in his philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Heidegger wrote a letter to Sartre saying that saying existence precedes essence is
Yes.
still a form of metaphysics. Do you agree with that statement?
Existence precedes essence.
He said that's still a metaphysical statement.
I think it is. I think so because it deals with, the way that I perceive metaphysics, it still deals with the way that we interact with objects in the world and how those interactions uniquely shape the way that we become. And even though Sartre starts from a different starting point in the context of how we start at that journey, right? I still think that the way that we interact with people uniquely shapes the way that our identity is formulated. For Sartre, it's a little different because his philosophy on being and nothingness is that we start from a point of nothing. Like that there is nothing. There's only, and a good way to view it is like a canvas, right? Our identity is like a painting canvas. And we are given colors, and we paint it however we see fit. Or we let other people paint it, if we let them take advantage of us, right? And it's because of that other people painting that I think that it's more of a metaphysical question. But yeah, that's just my opinion. Man.
So does that mean we can never be free of metaphysics?
I don't think so, no. But I don't think we need to.
Is there a reason Sartre rejected them?
in nothingness, or being in nothing. And only because it applied to Heidegger, so. And I know my brother hates Sartre. Maybe you can talk to my brother about it. I think he's read a little bit more Sartre than I do. He absolutely vehemently hates Sartre for, like, yeah,
Sartre,
the fool. Yeah, so Sartre is this guy that takes a lot from being in time. Creates a book called Being in Nothingness. Like I said before, he believes that our identity is like a blank canvas, that we are free. First, he believes, which is different from Heidegger, that we start at a point of nothingness. As in, there's nothing. Like, we have nothing that shapes us when we are born. We have nothing that uniquely changes and alters the way that we perceive the world until we choose to allow it to. Right? He also says we can't allow ourselves to be identified by others. We must identify ourselves. We must choose to exert our own will with regards to how we direct our identity. Which is probably another reason why Heidegger and Sartre would disagree so vehemently with regards to how our identity is formulated. Heidegger believes that we don't control our identity, right? He thinks we do, but we don't. He thinks that there are things that individually shape the way that we perceive the world. But we can't control that. We shouldn't. If we do, we embrace a mode of thought that carries over into how we treat people. Sartre thinks we do control the way our identity is formulated. So that's probably one of the biggest differences. One of the biggest. The other is that the starting point by which Sartre believes we start from nothingness. And that nothing uniquely shapes us in the context of how we begin our journey and the terms of our identity. But mostly, the biggest difference is that he believes we can control how our identity works, or like what our identity is, right? Heidegger thinks that that's not true, that we need to just let our identity be fluid, allow the experiences to shape us rather than us shape the experience. I think it's pretty hippie, so it's pretty cool. Cool. So now that we've learned quite a lot about metaphysics, let's talk about how we can apply that to debate. So does anybody have any ideas how we can apply certain philosophies that we just learned about to debate?
Hi, Jacob.
Hey, Jared. Oh, bye, Jared. Oh, hi, Shania. Bye, Shania. Bye. Bye. Take care. Any ideas? No one has any ideas? Yes.
Well, I can see how like the will of power could apply to like this topic.
Sure. How can it apply? Yeah, let's talk about how we can apply these things to this topic. This is a good exercise. How could the will of power pertain to this topic?
So the government should require like the powerful society, like the people who own the big corporations, the rich, to pay the weak more money and therefore like weaken themselves.
Yeah, I mean that could be one way to interpret Nietzsche, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the kind of thing is that like when we allow ourselves to succumb to gaining a living wage simply for survival, or gaining a living wage and allowing ourselves to think that, oh, we're helping these people in poverty, we kind of become like followers of a herd mentality, where we simply try to support the work of the poor to be praised by the government and gain a conception of justice and like a set notion of justice that a herd follower gives us to the herd.
Yeah, so you could make the argument that like the notion of justice is a universalizable notion, like is a universal concept of justice, right? That is a moral good. Nietzsche would definitely criticize that. I think you definitely could, without attempting to be borderline offensive about that like the attempt to like give a living wage is just like a Nietzsche would say that would probably be bad because it would it would be a way to, without allowing the slaves to become the masters of their own right, utilizing their own will to power, it would be offering something that would attempt to put them at an equal footing of the master, which would not be something I think you should argue, but you could. But I don't think you would. It's very fascist. Nietzsche's just a fascist, guys. That's all I know. All right, let's talk about Heidegger. How can we apply Heidegger to this topic? Actually, who saw the debate last night between myself and Arun?
Me.
Who'd you think won?
You.
You're damn right I did. Did you turn off the camera?
It's only because I love Heidegger.
It's only because what?
It's only because I love Heidegger.
There you go. That's right. That's fine. I love him too. I'm going to show you the case I wrote for that.
Did you ever get an approximate like distribution of the votes?
No, I didn't want to know. It's been a very listen. It had been a very long time since I had debated LD. Okay, this was the Heidegger K that I wrote for this topic. So let's kind of dissect it so that we can see how this could maybe be a starting point for you guys in the context of how to write Heideggerian critiques on this topic. Our lab kind of talked about this, and I think maybe we came to an understanding of what it says. Did we? Yes? No, we still didn't. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so there's a role about blah, blah, blah. That doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Okay, the critique, right. So capitalist destabilization, actually it should say capitalism's destabilization, is necessary for our ontological development. An attempt to reduce the uncertainty of life is a way to reduce anxiety. Disconnecting us from the unconcealing of the earth, this leads us not to understand the earth but ourselves. What does the text say? In English, what does the text say? Anybody else want to take a stab?
So I think the text is basically saying that like if you let capitalism just like collapse on like itself, then it's a way for us to like increase our anxiety and therefore let the world like conceal itself.
Right. So like the argument is that capitalism. So and this is borderlining on Heideggerian Marxism, because there's a lot of new movements now that try to tie Marxist philosophy and angles to Heidegger. This part particularly talks about how the world, in particular capitalism, is a system that is going to fall because of its unsustainability through Marxist philosophy. And that capitalism's unsustainability and fall creates anxiety within us because we don't want the economic system to collapse because that's all we know, right? What does that sound a lot like? We just talked about it like 20 minutes ago. Yes?
Nietzsche?
No. Not Nietzsche. You guys clocked out already? I still have you for like 5 more minutes. Does anybody want to take a stab at what? Who says it? Who says that we can't reduce uncertainty? Yes. Yeah, it's absolutely technocratic thought. So the argument is that the capitalist system is going to fall. We can't accept that. So we will, actually later in the card's really good and specific to talk about how we desire to recover things as they were, and we need to shore up the world to make it seem natural. Otherwise, the subject will be cut adrift, and whenever the system of privatization and deregulation collapses, we deploy a range of prejudices to race, nation, class, blame the lack of money, public sector, public spending, to rescue the referential totality of the system. What does that mean, the referential totality of the system? Okay, so Heidegger is all about how we will anchor on to points of reference that are stable, right? That's how we find stability, because we create these anchors, we create these systems that are stable in our minds, and whenever those systems are disrupted, is he sleeping? He's meditating. He's meditating. This is a good example of meditation at work. It sees the earth as it is. Okay. So let's make this really quick. It's fine. The argument is that the living wage system. That's fine. It's fine. We only got a couple minutes left anyway. It's not like he's going to learn like everything now in like 2 minutes. The capitalist system.
Wait, you have to ask about this later.
Oh, I will. It's fine. So the argument is that living wage is an attempt to create capitalism to continue the system of capital and capitalism. Why is that bad according to Heidegger? It's stability, and if capitalism falls, it creates anxiety. So the argument that Neg was making was that your dependence on living wage is another attempt for you to control reality because you can't accept the anxiousness that comes with the notion of not having capitalism there. That is a technocratic thought process. Your dependency on the capitalist system creates an alternative which you call, the affirmative calls, living wage. And this living wage alternative is not to create good, it's to continue the cycle of capitalism because you don't know what's going to happen if capitalism falls. And that uncertainty and anxiety frightens you. The heart and soul of what Heidegger criticizes about, right? That we can't accept the fact that there are things outside the bounds of our control. And we don't want to be around things that we don't know about. So, that creates like technocratic thought, blah, blah, blah. The solution is just to embrace it, embrace thought, calculative, or contemplative and like meditative thought after the system has collapsed. So that could be a way to use Heidegger. For those of y'all that even care. So what did we learn today?
We learned that Nietzsche is a fascist.
Well, yes.
And I should not run his arguments.
Well, you can. He's just fascist. Be prepared.
Do you read Author and Dice of Heidegger as well?
If you want... Wait, did I ever read Author and Dice on Heidegger?
No, could we?
No.
Nazi.
No. I mean, you could if you want. That's pretty trivializing.
That would probably
It's called Holocaust trivialization.
That would also break Koshak's point.
Kant was a racist.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that Kant's philosophy needs to be discarded.
But
You can't.
But people read index on all the time.
Author and Dice are dumb.
I don't disagree.
They're dumb. I think they're dumb.
Can you read
Yes.
it? I think that's